The Seahawks officially have got their guy under center, Sam Darnold, the new starting quarterback for the Seahawks. Going to be breaking down the newest addition and how he fits into Klint Kubiak's offense here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it, whether you're tuning in from Bellevue, Washington, or down in Fort Worth, Texas. We appreciate each and every one of you. A busy first day of free agency, the legal tampering period in play starting today. Contracts can't be signed until Wednesday, but the Seahawks have their new starting quarterback, Sam Darnold, agreeing to terms with the team. I'm going to be diving into all the details we know so far about that contract, the value of it, and of course, his fit with the Seahawks offensively. And I'm going to take a look at the remaining needs on free agency and which players, at least as of right this second, have yet to sign that the Seahawks could potentially be in the mix to bring onto the roster. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now for your lead story here on our legal tampering day, Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks traded Geno Smith on Friday in exchange for a third-round pick to the Raiders. It was a stunning move for many, one that was unexpected. But when contract negotiations broke down, Seattle decided to pivot. And with Pete Carroll wanting to reunite with Geno Smith, they reached that deal. And the speculation immediately was that Sam Darnold was going to be the front runner to replace him. Turns out that speculation came true, with Darnold agreeing to terms on a 3-year, $100.5 million deal, $55 million guaranteed on this contract. Now, some 12s may be looking at this deal thinking, man, $100.5 million for a quarterback who in his first 5 seasons struggled mightily in New York and Carolina. The last year that he started 6 games for the Panthers, 7 touchdowns, 3 picks. The year before that, he had 9 touchdowns, 13 picks, only 6 more touchdowns and interceptions his 3 years with the New York Jets. But this is a very similar story to what Geno Smith endured, where his career started off really bumpy in New York. The only difference here is that Darnold didn't have to wait 5 or 6 years to get that next chance to be a starter. He had 1 season where he was a full-time backup in San Francisco with Klint Kubiak, who is now the offensive coordinator. He was the passing game coordinator in San Francisco. He's now the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks. So there's a relationship there. This deal allows the Seahawks to bring in a 27-year-old quarterback that still has room to grow, has room to develop, and it's in an offensive system, as I'll talk about more later in the show, that does really fit the skill set and the strengths of Sam Darnold. And so really how this all panned out, Geno Smith returning, that's what the Seahawks wanted. They wanted to have an extension with Geno Smith after starting the last 3 seasons. But they had a line they were not going to cross in terms of salary. And once it became apparent that Geno Smith wanted $45 million per year, at least that's what the reports are suggesting, the Seahawks decided, you know what, we're going to pass on that. There wasn't a counteroffer that was given by Smith and his representatives. And you had limited time. The Seahawks wanted some stability at quarterback. They didn't want question marks there. They didn't want to go into free agency. And you had March 16th deadline day for roster bonuses for Geno Smith coming up. So they had a very short window to try to make a decision here. And ultimately, without that counteroffer coming back from Smith's team, it was evident to John Schneider and the rest of the Seahawks front office that this wasn't going to come together as quickly as it needed to. And they decided to go a different direction at quarterback. They promptly went to Sam Darnold. And from my understanding, these negotiations came together very quickly. They figured out that the price tag was going to be more in the wheelhouse of what they were willing to pay for Sam Darnold. And we're talking a Baker Mayfield type contract here. In fact, that's what the reports have suggested, that the Seahawks used Baker Mayfield's contract with the Buccaneers as a baseline, as a blueprint for signing Sam Darnold. And they were able to quickly sort through this stuff. And by Monday, this presented the best opportunity for Sam Darnold to get some stability. This is a player that's had a lot of one-year contracts in recent years. He wanted to have a multi-year deal for good money that gave him a chance to further prove himself as well after having a Pro Bowl season for the Vikings last year. So everything was able to come together here. Now, the bottom line is Geno Smith did a lot of really good things in Seattle, and there's some risk moving on from him. We've talked about that ad nauseum since Friday when this trade was made, that you're moving on from a quarterback that dealt with a lot of bad circumstantial things the last couple years. He had a terrible offensive line in front of him, was sacked more than any quarterback in the league the last 3 years, pressured more than any quarterback in the league. They didn't have a run game last year. The year before, it wasn't much better. So the support mechanisms that were at play certainly impacted Geno Smith's numbers. That put a lot of burden on his shoulders, and there were some mistakes that certainly were made along the way. This is a roll of the dice because Sam Darnold could very easily be that player that after one breakout year in ideal environment goes to another team and isn't able to replicate that. We have seen this happen a lot in NFL history where breakout quarterbacks go to another team and they are not able to come close to producing at that level. Darnold has youth on his side, and he certainly has the physical tools. There's a reason he was picked in the top 5 in the 2018 NFL draft, 3rd overall by the Jets to be exact. He has the arm talent. He had more yardage on deep passes, according to NFL Next Gen stats, than any quarterback in the league last year. So you can still take those shots downfield. They're going to have to get some receivers that they can get the football to, obviously, but you can take your shots. He's underrated as an athlete. He's not going to be somebody you're going to do a bunch of designed runs with, but he can get away from pressure. You can use him on bootlegs, rollouts. And this is a quarterback that last year was surprisingly going against the narrative, pretty good against pressure. He threw 13 touchdown passes last year, according to Pro Football Focus, when he was under pressure. Now, the last 2 games, there's recency bias here. He absolutely did not play well at the end of the regular season and their playoff loss to the Rams. He was under pressure constantly, and he willed it under that pressure. And that has been an issue throughout Sam Darnold's career. But you saw improvements most of last season in Minnesota. And Kevin O'Connell did a really good job of having play calling that took pressure off him. They had just a good enough run game that they were able to get their play action passing attack going. So you're talking about a quarterback here who really had an ideal environment. He had the right coach. The Seahawks are hoping that Klint Kubiak, who has worked with him previously, is going to be able to carry that over. But as far as signing goes, we got to see how this plays out with the rest of free agency. I'm going to give this a B right now, and I'll explain more where the fit is at offensive scheme-wise in the next segment. But I'm going to give a B on this signing because I do think you're talking about 18th highest paid quarterback in the NFL average per year. He played like a top 10 quarterback for most of last season. Now, is he going to be able to do that in Seattle without Justin Jefferson, without Kevin O'Connell, without DK Metcalf being here? It remains to be seen what he is going to be able to do in this offense, and the Seahawks are going to have to make a lot of moves to be able to support him. They got to rebuild this offense around their new quarterback. With that being said, again, you're giving him that 18th overall, 18th ranked average per year contract, and the guaranteed money is just in the first 2 years. So this really should be looked at as a 2-year, $55 million contract, and then we'll wait and see what year 3 looks like. If he goes out and plays extremely well this year, then maybe another year down the road, you could end up extending him. Because he's only 27, this could be a quarterback that could be your starter for the next 10 plus years, potentially. But you also have to look at those first 5 years before he broke out in Minnesota and wonder if circumstances are going to cause him to regress back to that quarterback that couldn't hold on to starting jobs in New York and Carolina. If that ends up happening and this blows up in Seattle's face and Geno Smith is playing well in Las Vegas, they could be competing for a top 5 pick next year to go get their future quarterback. And who knows if John Schneider gets to make that selection. Seattle can move on with not having to absorb too big of a salary cap hit. I believe it would be $19 million that they would have to eat if they cut him after one season. So they have given themselves outs, at least affordable ones. But They are confident that this young man is going to be able to build off what he did last year, in large part because it should be a familiar system. And I'm going to be diving into that coming up next year, looking at the fit for Sam Darnold and why ultimately he ended up being the one the Seahawks pivoted to once they realized that Geno Smith was not going to sign an extension at their price point. I'm going to get to that coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find your every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com, only available with TurboTax Live full-service app. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in here on the first day of the legal tampering period. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen. We greatly appreciate it. Sam Darnold, the new starting quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks, signing a 3-year, $100.5 million contract, $55 million in guarantees. It was a fantastic breakout season for Darnold last year. After rookie J.J. McCarthy suffered a knee injury in training camp, Darnold became the starter, and Kevin O'Connell, the head coach, did such a phenomenal job of putting Darnold in a position to succeed and playing to his strengths. He allowed him to take those shots downfield. They got him moving on bootlegs and rollouts. They had a run game that was middle of the pack, but listen, you don't have to have a top 5 run game to have an effective offense. You just have to have something of a semblance of a complementary run game, which the Minnesota Vikings did have last year with Aaron Jones. Teams at least had to respect their run game, and that opened up the play action passing attack. As far as fit goes, you can question Sam Darnold's career path to this point and say, I don't know if I like the idea of giving $100 million to a quarterback who has had 1 really good season and 5 bad ones, because that is Sam Darnold's career in a nutshell. New York was a disaster, seeing ghosts in the pocket, for example. 2 years in Carolina, didn't have a lot around him, but for the most part, take away a 3-0 start, his first year as the starter there, it was a disaster in Carolina as well. I can understand the skepticism, and I've even raised some concerns up to this point because I have watched this kid earlier in his career wield under pressure, and I saw that come back late in the season for the Minnesota Vikings last year. But that's not accounting for what we saw for most of the regular season, leading the Vikings to a 14-3 record, throwing for over 4,300 yards, 35 touchdowns. He ranked in the top 5 among quarterbacks in passing yards and passing touchdowns last year. He also was among league leaders in big-time throws, 7.9 yards per attempt, ranked 6th. So he took his shots downfield. Minnesota was aggressive, and they let this kid use his arm talent. The Seahawks are going to want to do the same, even with the changes they have in their receiving core. They are going to want to have those shots. And this is why I think Sam Darnold jumped out to the Seahawks when they realized that Geno Smith is not going to be extended. And I'm sure these discussions were had earlier. Hey, if negotiations don't go how we want them to go, where are we going to pivot? And it's not surprising that Sam Darnold was the one that the Seahawks decided to go with because, as I mentioned earlier, familiarity matters when you're looking at a free agent quarterback going to another team. And while Klint Kubiak was not the 49ers play caller in 2023, Kyle Shanahan calls the plays, the head coach, he was the passing game coordinator, and he was heavily involved with working with Brock Purdy, who had a phenomenal second season in the league, and Sam Darnold's the backup. Darnold threw for 287 yards and 2 touchdowns in the start that he had late in the season for San Francisco 2 years ago when they had the division wrapped up. Darnold played really well in that game. And I think that was a stepping stone for what we saw in Minnesota. And the fact that Kyle Shanahan's system, it's not identical. There's some differences, but there are plenty of parallels to what Kevin O'Connell is running in Minnesota. He comes from Sean McVay's coaching tree. Sean McVay worked with Kyle Shanahan in Washington. There's carryover in these offenses. And Klint Kubiak, look, the Kubiak tree stems directly from Mike Shanahan's offense. So again, there's a lot of carryover with some individual wrinkles, some differences. I think from a personnel and formation standpoint, Klint Kubiak's going to be running the ship a lot differently than Minnesota did. The Vikings were not a heavy two-back or three tight end usage team. Kubiak historically has used the fullback a lot, and he has loved to play two tight end sets, a lot fewer sets with three wide receivers on the field than what Kevin O'Connell does. But in terms of concepts, leaning on the zone ground game, particularly wide zone, you're going to see a lot of parallels between these offenses. And so I think that's one of the big reasons that Sam Darnold stood out as a player that the Seahawks wanted to target, that they wanted to pursue if Geno Smith was not going to work out. Because when you look at how quarterbacks have performed for Klint Kubiak in the past, whether it was the Vikings during his 3 years there, one of those seasons as an offensive coordinator, or this past season in New Orleans, his quarterbacks have had a lot of success in the play-action passing game, even though they weren't near the top of the league last year in play-action percentage, in terms of drop-back percentage. The Saints were really effective running play-action, particularly when Derek Carr was healthy. That was a big part of their game. They finished in the top 15 in rushing yards. You go back to the Minnesota Vikings in 2020 with Klint Kubiak as the offensive coordinator. He was able to get their run game going with Dalvin Cook, and Kirk Cousins had 30-plus touchdowns that season. And Cousins thrived throughout his career off of play action. So I think you're going to see that type of a recipe here where Klint Kubiak wants to get that ground game going. That has been an emphasis with the coaching staff moves, getting John Benton as the offensive line coach, Rick Dennison as your seasoned veteran assistant and run game coordinator, Justin Alton coming in with his running back and offensive line background as well. That clearly has been an emphasis. They need to make moves to adjust their personnel. They've got to get the offensive line better. But if they can get the run game going the way that Klint Kubiak and Mike McDonald are wanting it to, and this is at least a middle-of-the-pack respectable run game that teams have to account for with Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet and company. If they can do that, it creates a real opportunity for that play-action passing game. And no quarterback in the NFL was better last year on play action than Sam Darnold, at least in terms of touchdowns. He threw 16 touchdowns last year off of play action passes, the most in the NFL. If Klint Kubiak can do what Kevin O'Connell was able to do in Minnesota and able to get that run game going, the play action working off of it, give Sam Darnold that balanced offense where he's not shouldering the entire load, and you get some of those bootlegs and rollouts that Kubiak is well known for, and really everybody from the Shanahan tree is known for. You sprinkle in those things with a more effective run game, and I think Sam Darnold can absolutely be a highly successful quarterback for the Seahawks on this contract. But they've got to get the personnel around him, and that's the other end of the spectrum here. I think the system is in place. I think this is the right scheme for Sam Darnold to be successful, but they have to have the personnel around him or it's not going to matter. And it starts with the offensive line. As of the recording of the show, no other additions to this football team had been made to this point, but they need to go out and get at least one veteran offensive lineman during this cycle that is a proven starter. They got to find a way to do that so that they can run the football and they can do a better job from the interior protecting their quarterback, because Sam Darnold's numbers were solid last year, but look, I think that is a big difference between him and Geno Smith. I think Geno Smith is better at mitigating a sloppy pocket and having consistent pressure than what Sam Darnold is going to be. You are going to have an offensive line that can give him a little bit more time so that he doesn't rush into throws. You're going to have a better line that can get that run game going, because you can't ask Sam Darnold to throw 50 times a game. There's going to have to be a more balanced approach. There's going to have to be an alteration in offensive philosophy in order for this to work. And I think if you do get that run game going, that Sam Darnold's physical tools will show up. He'll be able to get some of those deep passes going, particularly off play action. And he has a track record of throwing to tight ends as well That's going to be a big part of this offense. I think there's a lot of things lining up for this to be successful, but there's a lot of ifs, and it's mainly with the personnel groupings. And so that's where it's going to boil down to here. The Seahawks have got to find a way the next few days, the next few weeks. They've got to get some other veteran presences on this offense, particularly the offensive line. They got to get some veterans that can come in and rebuild this foundation around their quarterback, because if they're not able to successfully do that, this is set up to be a failure for a quarterback that I do think has to have really good circumstances around it, or at least favorable circumstances with a run game. I don't know that he can shoulder the load the way that Geno Smith has the last couple of years without a consistent run game and a bad offensive line. I don't know that Sam Darnold can do that. I think if you have those elements there, that the ceiling is going to be higher, and you have a guy that may have more upside because he's a younger quarterback still. But I think the environment's got to be controlled more for him to be able to thrive. And so that's going to be the key for the Seahawks. Can you do what the Vikings did and build that foundation around Sam Darnold that gives him the chance to succeed and makes it that he isn't constantly under duress? And then you've got a run game that you can lean on to get the play action passing game going. If they're not able to do those things, it's going to be hard for this to be successful. So there's some boomer bust potential here, but I think at the price point and with this scheme, that it does make sense why the Seahawks made this move. And I think there is a pathway for Sam Darnold being very successful, maybe even to the point that he gets a second contract with the Seahawks. It's really going to be a wait and see thing, though, and it depends on how the Seahawks build around their new quarterback, whether he's going to be successful or not. When I come back, speaking of that foundation personnel-wise, going to be breaking down some of the free agents that have been signed and some that are still in the market that could be good fits for the Seahawks here midway through the first day of legal tampering as they try to build around their new starting quarterback. Going to get to that up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends over at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my team for a late-game rally or picking LeBron James to make a game-winning dunk. I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, and thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Free agency officially underway. Contracts cannot be signed until Wednesday, and that includes Sam Darnold, at least for the outside free agents. Extensions can be signed, obviously. So the real contracts won't be signed until Wednesday, but a lot of the moves falling, the dominoes falling here on the first day of the legal tampering day. And there have already been a few unfortunate misses if you're a Seahawks fan. And Drew Dalman being the most notable. I've talked about him a ton the last few weeks, the Falcons center. And from my understanding, the Seahawks were never going to be in the mix there because of his preference. And he wanted to play for Ben Johnson, the new head coach for the Chicago Bears. Signed a deal for $42 million on 3 seasons. That's $14 million per year. So again, the price point, I think the Seahawks easily could have done that. But it sounds like the Chicago Bears were the front runner from the outset, and a lot of teams that may have had interest were turned away here. This was not going to be a complete cash grab. Drew Dalman wanted to go to Chicago. He wanted to play for Ben Johnson. So you can count out the #1 center, at least in this scheme, for availability. He is off the market. There's been a few guards that have been plucked up as well. Aaron Banks, formerly of the 49ers, going to the Green Bay Packers on a 4-year deal worth $77 million. Patrick McCarry, formerly of the Ravens, a guy that I've talked about a lot that I thought made sense for the Seahawks, also going to the Jacksonville Jaguars. What does that mean for the Seahawks now, though, with these 3 players off the board in terms of free agency? If you look at the center spot, there's a couple other players that could make some sense if the Seahawks want to go the free agency route. Ryan Kelly is getting to be an older player. He's had some injury issues. There was even some talk about him retiring. Don't know if you want to go down another Connor Williams pipe, but is still a solid player. If the Seahawks want to go the free agent route, Kelly's been a good zone and gap blocker throughout his career. He can pass protect with the best of them. And Josh Myers from Green Bay, the Packers just made it clear they're going to be shifting their viewpoint at the center position. They're going to be moving guys around. Probably not going to bring Josh Myers back. He has been inconsistent in his first 4 years in the league, but he's an athletic enough center that I think could make some sense, and he's got some untapped potential still being a pretty young player. So those two guys are still on the board for the Seahawks to look at if they're wanting to upgrade the center position. As for the guard spots, a couple names that are still out there that make some sense to me from a scheme standpoint. Tevin Jenkins is not going back to the Chicago Bears. The Bears have done a masterful job of overhauling their offensive line. They went out and traded for Joe Thuney from the Kansas City Chiefs, traded a fourth-round pick for him. That filled one of their guard spots. The other guard spot, they got Jonah Jackson from the Rams after a disappointing one season in L.A. He's looking to bounce back with Ben Johnson, who he played for in Detroit. And then they got Drew Dahlman in the center position. So there's nowhere for Tevin Jenkins to go. Formerly a tackle early in his career at Oklahoma State at the college level, he's got enough athleticism, I think, to be a solid guard playing in a zone blocking scheme. And he's still only 27 years old. He's a young player. There were some injuries early in his career, but I thought he had some pretty good tape last year in Chicago. He's a player that makes some sense here. And then Mekhi Becton from New York, from Philadelphia, actually started his career in New York, won the Super Bowl converting to guard for the Eagles. The Eagles are not going to have the money to bring him back with some of the other moves that they have had to make. There is a connection here in Seattle. John Benton coached Becton with the New York Jets his first couple of seasons. So those two know each other well. There's already that connection there. And Becton, for being a 360-pound man, he can move. He is an athletic big guy that showed last year he can do gap schemes. He can do the zone stuff. I don't know if he's the most ideal fit for this offense, but those are two players that are still very much available that could make some sense. And if you're wanting to go from an older spectrum, I don't think Kevin Zeitler will go out west, but they could certainly look at a few of the other second and third tier players. But if you're looking for two guys that could come in and be immediate upgrades at those guard spots, I think Tevin Jenkins makes a lot of sense. James Daniels coming off an injury for the Steelers would also be a player that would make some sense if he's able to check things out. And the front runner here, and I wanted to finish off talking about this, Will Fries from the Indianapolis Colts. He's coming off a severe injury. And the reason I didn't mention him first and foremost, I'm wondering if he's going to need to have physicals to sign. And that means on-site visits, which players can't do until Wednesday. He might be the best guard in this class, not named Trey Smith, franchised by Kansas City. The injury question marks, though, are why he's not getting talked up a lot. I would not be shocked if the Seahawks are looking at him closely and wanting to get him in for a visit and a physical to see where he's at after missing most of last season with a significant leg injury. So you've got Jenkins, you've got Fries, you've got Mekhi Becton, you've also got a player in Zeitler maybe that could be available. There's still some guards out there. It's been a slow-moving process. So I think the Seahawks are still very much in it on a few of these guys, and we'll see if they're able to sign one to really upgrade their offensive line. And going away from the skill positions, or to the skill positions, away from the offensive line, players that have been signed so far, there haven't been any that have signed with other teams that I had down in my short list that would make sense for the Seahawks. You still have Juwan Johnson, the tight end from the New Orleans Saints, who played in Kubiak's system last year. That is still a really good fit to put back with Kubiak that is available, at least at the start of this podcast. Had not announced a signing. I think that Elijah Moore, the former Ole Miss receiver that played in New York and Cleveland, he has not had good quarterback play, let alone great quarterback play for most of his career. It would be kind of ironic to see a guy that burned out in New York with the Jets as a receiver because the quarterbacks were so bad, to see him and Sam Darnold both go to Seattle together. They did not play together in New York. Their careers didn't overlap, but it'd be interesting to see those guys both take off in Seattle because I still think Elijah Moore has the talent to be an 800, 900,000 yard caliber receiver. He just hasn't been able to put it together, in part because the quarterback limitations and playing on bad football teams. So that is a player, along with Juwan Johnson, that I am keeping a very close eye on. Josh Palmer from the Chargers would be another receiver, a bigger bodied guy that can create after the catch, can be a possession target, has some downfield ability. He is another player that I'm keeping an eye on as well, because Seattle's going to have to add a receiver at some point in this free agency cycle. There's not a lot of depth. It's not a top-heavy group either with any elite talents that are available. Those guys don't hit free agency. But I think that Elijah Moore and Joshua Palmer could both be players that could come in and help make up for some of that lost production that DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett leave behind, with Jackson Smith and Jigba obviously being the clear number one target. There's plenty of talent still out there. Defensive side of the ball, players like Harold Landry are still available. A lot of defensive linemen are getting picked up, but there are still plenty of good players. John Schneider, I'm sure, is working the phones trying to get some deals struck with some of these players, because the Seahawks have cap flexibility and they have a number of holes after making the moves that they have made. But there's certainly more moves to be made. I don't know if we see another one today, but I anticipate that the Seahawks are going to have one or two moves here in the early stages of free agency away from the quarterback spot, particularly on the offensive line. I do think that's coming down the pipe. It just depends if it's somebody like Will Fries. It might be a few more days because they got to get that physical done with him. And that's, again, just speculating, not reporting. But if they are trying to get him, then that certainly would be the situation that they're going to be facing. If they're wanting to invest all that money, they want to make sure that he is healthy, recovered from that injury that cost him most of the 2024 season. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. We'll have more free agent frenzy news tomorrow. Hopefully some offensive line additions in free agency, maybe a skill player as well. Going to keep diving into all the latest news here at the start of the new league year on our Tuesday show. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.